So it's my pleasure to introduce this year's Vision Speaker for NASIG, Janetta Waterhouse. Janetta is the Director of the Technical Services and Library Systems Division at the University at Albany, which is made up of the Acquisition Services, Discovery Services, Metadata Services, and Library Systems departments. Prior to coming to the UA, she served in director roles at West Virginia University and University of Illinois at Springfield as an implementation manager at OCLC, a technical analyst in an information consortium, and other library systems positions. She received an undergraduate degree in computer science with a minor in mathematics and a graduate degree in library and information science from the University of Iowa. She's completing a second master's degree in IT management and leadership from the UIS, where she also completed a graduate certificate in human resource management. She holds a project management professional certification and specializes in providing effective management and leadership at the intersection of technology, people, and projects. And today, Janetta is going to be talking to us on the topic of, oh, I'm sorry, I lost the exact title, but she's going to be talking about change management, and I'm sure we'll be introducing her topic much better than I did. So welcome, Janetta, and thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I'm a little nervous because of the online format. I'm used to seeing faces and getting some feedback, so we'll see how it goes. Change. What emotions come up when you hear this word? Is it this unwelcome, unrelenting directive from some controlling source? Is it perhaps a siren call to you, beckoning you to glorious and rocky shores? It's a very emotionally charged word in our environment, even before everything that has come up, but especially more so. And it is kind of a dividing line for us. Are you an adrenaline junkie on the leading edge of every change coming along? Or are you a Luddite stuck in the mud, throttling progress? In my experience working with organizations through change, people want to make sure they put a stake in one side or the other, or to be particularly neutral. But would it surprise you to know that even those of us who have a relatively high risk tolerance still have a lot of doubts? You know, those of us who are more comfortable with change, we still wonder, is this the right change at the right time? Did I engage people in the right way? Did I set the schedule too fast or too slow? What could I have done differently? You know, what is it about change? It is happening more frequently now in society, and the expectation is that we're going to be more comfortable with it, handle it better. And why are some people so averse to change while other people think it's so necessary? When I worked at the University of Illinois at Springfield, I started working on my second master's degree in computer science, and I had the opportunity to take an IT leadership program, and I decided that I wanted to focus on leadership. So I used my computer science courses as part of an IT management and leadership degree that I'm nearing the end of, just have to finish my thesis. And I realized something over the years and the over 100 articles and the multiple textbooks and other books that I've read and other sources that I thought would help libraries. And I don't really consider myself a visionary. So when I was first asked, I was hesitant, but I had gotten a lot of good feedback on the types of information that I was sharing. So I agreed, and I tend to take every opportunity I can to share this information that I've put together. It's not really my information, just how I've collated it from various sources. And what I found is that there is a way forward to be successful. So imagine in libraries that you hired a new person, whether they have a library degree or not. And on their first day in technical services, you tell them with no library experience, This publisher has changed their publication pattern, go into this system and make that change for us. Or let's say we have a journal title change, go catalog that for us. What are the odds that that person is going to be successful, right? They're not going to be successful because they don't have the knowledge that they need to do their job. In libraries, we might be implementing a new system. We might be piloting new purchasing models. What does it take to be successful? Well, as a leader, as a change agent, as a project manager, you don't have to manage people to be a leader. In fact, every organization needs leaders from within in order to be successful. What does it take? Well, it takes domain knowledge. And over the years that I was working on my program, you know, one course at a time and moving and changing jobs a couple times, I realized that having a map to this domain knowledge would be helpful for people. I hadn't found it anywhere. It's a lot of information. I will say that I'm probably breaking all kinds of presentation rules by providing a dense amount of information, but I have gotten a good response from it in the past. And I think it's because those of us who work in libraries love organizing information. And so this is a way to kind of put a framework together quickly for people who can then go off and do things. As I mentioned, I was particularly interested in learning about leadership, and not just, you know, the kind of practitioner books that you could buy at Barnes & Noble, although many of them are great. I was interested in what does the scholarship of leadership look like? You know, what are the definitions and the theories? And so I've put this together. The slides have been made available, and I'll confess that there are a few more slides in the PDF than what I'm going to cover. The material's just too dense for a presentation format. But I think it's useful information in case that's something that you're interested in. So what I'm providing here today is this kind of jump start by mapping the domain of change management, leadership, and a very little bit on project management. But what I encourage each of you to do, however you're taking notes, maybe just in your head or on paper electronically, is to make two lists. And one is to keep in mind what you're bringing to the table. Don't start from a position of deficit of what you don't know. Everybody's bringing something to the table. You have a lot invested in your careers, and you're bringing a certain kind of expertise, and make sure you're aware of that and don't minimize that. And the other list I would encourage you to make is the things that are specific that I'm going to talk about that apply to you in your situation with the change initiative that you have on your plate. All of it together is a lot. You know, it was years in the making, and every situation is specific. So I encourage you to kind of use these directions to select and use what works for you. Now, I have to start with this whole question about the difference between management and leadership. That's something that comes up a lot. And while I think it is possible, you know, one school of thought is leadership is totally separate from management. You can be a great visionary leader and not be able to manage your way out of a sack. There may be corporations or global organizations big enough to have that kind of visionary leader. My own personal opinion and in my experience, libraries aren't among those. You know, I've had bosses who were great managers and maybe not particularly innovative, and they were great places to work. I've known of situations where there was a lot of vision and idea generating without the ability to implement, and those were difficult places. There was just a lot of frustration, a lot of contention. So I fall on the side that management is a subset, that leadership is a subset of management. That if you're a new manager or interested in management, I would encourage you to focus on those skills. And there may be Q&A about, well, what's the difference? There's one phrase that if you haven't heard, you may hear that I think kind of sums it up. Managers do things right, and leaders do the right things. So if you're in a place where you're already doing the things you need to be doing, you're on a path and it's just almost a status quo, then you want to have these management skills. This is my list. But if you're working on a change initiative of some significance, you're focusing on how to kind of redirect people, and that's no small task, which is why I'm focusing on it today. So as far as management goes, the top of the list is communication and active listening. They really go together, but they're worth separating. You're going to have a lot to do, so you should have time management and productivity skills down and be able to coach other people in those. Team building is essential. And if there was ever a time to make a case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, professional development, implicit bias training, recognizing microaggressions, bystander intervention, now is that time. Performance management, I think, is a cornerstone to managing people. I'm going to talk more about that. And for those of us, especially in technical services, process management, workflow analysis is very critical to be an effective manager. So although my focus is on mapping this domain for leadership, change management, and project management, it is within this context, this overarching context of management. And over the years in managing people and talking about managing people with others and participating in workshops and conducting sessions, I have come across what I think are very good management tips, and those are going to be noted with this extra label here up on the side. And what that means is that it's really more applicable across the board and not just specific to change management. And I'm going to start with a tip. If you're a manager, do your job. Performance management is essential. I think some people want to think that it's about being too nice to give difficult feedback to people, but feedback is so important. And if you're not going to do it, who else can, right? And I'm not saying that it's easy, it's difficult, I've struggled with it, but what I can say positively is that it gets easier the more you do it. I have a couple more slides with more information that I'm going to put up for you to read while I talk through this very important topic. I've had past work experience in one case with someone who was incredibly difficult, very negative, overbearing, hard to work with. And her boss, my colleague, I think felt like she was just too nice to, deal with that. What I realized as I was working through my coursework and my leadership training is that not giving feedback to one person meant like a dozen of us were suffering. There's nothing nice about that, right? So don't kid yourself that you or your colleagues are just too nice, because if other people are struggling, it's something that you need to address. In another situation, another colleague was a very incompetent individual, didn't do their job, wasn't interested in doing a good job. And that boss, we had the same boss, thought they were too collegial, I guess, to deal with it. So what they did instead was to redistribute that person's work among others of us. So not a great work environment. And those were under normal circumstances, those can be challenging. If you have change initiatives, especially significant ones, if your managers aren't dealing with that piece of it, everything else is going to be much harder. And I sometimes at this point get questions about, oh gosh, I've experienced this, what should I do? I'm not checking the Q&A right now, but I will be circling back to this topic. As I mentioned, my second master's degree was to focus on leadership. Around that time, I also had the opportunity to work as an implementation manager for a library services platform, and then have had a couple positions since then where I was on the other side of the fence working in a library that was migrating to a library services platform. And as I mentioned, leadership is often very, very closely tied with change, right? You need good leadership to make changes. So change management became something I felt I needed to learn more about. And it is really kind of its own discipline and has its own domain. There is the formal definition there. The second one is how I refer to it, an approach to transition individuals and teams and organizations to that desired future state, right? You go through your strategic planning process, you look at this desired future state, where you want to go, you evaluate where you're at, where you're currently at, and how to close the gap, right? And why is that so important? Well, you know, look where we're at globally with technology and innovation and change. And I will take just a moment here to say that I appreciate the opening remarks that Kristen shared. This is a really troubling time that we're in. What I would say is that my focus is on organizational change. Remember, I majored in computer science, so I don't know how applicable these topics are to the societal change that is so desperately needed right now. I leave that for others to interpret. So when it comes to change management, there are many models to look at. There are many more than I can cover today, but if you're particularly interested in change management, if that's one of the areas you're putting on your list to focus on, you might do a search for change management models. I'm going to talk about 3 that are pretty common. John Kotter is an emeritus professor from Harvard, and his 8 steps are very well known as if you're looking into leadership and change. I actually first ran across it with the article listed at the bottom, which put the spin on, here's everything that can go wrong. And when I first presented on it, it was a little tough because you want to focus on, here's what you can do right with your upcoming change. But I found, you know, eventually this website that's listed here puts them in that positive sense. And I will say that I used this heavily with the SUNY-wide migration from Olive to Alma that the University at Albany participated in. We went live last year. In particular, I think having that strategic vision and getting change agents, that volunteer army, is very important. The Kubler-Ross change curve is a model that focuses more on the emotional responses, so and the phases that people move through. So if you're in an organization where everybody's on board and everybody's excited about the change, this might not be a good model for you. In my experience, people who work in libraries have had years to become experts at what they're doing in these systems that they're doing them in. And when you migrate from these legacy ILSs, these client server technology from the 90s, to these next generation library service platforms, the LSPs, these cloud hosted systems, it's a big change. And what you're doing is you're taking their expertise away from them. And that is hard for people. It's a very emotional thing. So this may very well be a model that works for you. Lewin's change model is one that also comes up quite a bit. And the idea here is that you unfreeze through preparation and getting buy-in, you implement the change, and then you refreeze with internalizing these changes. There are many, many dimensions of change to look into. There are internal and external drivers. Sometimes an external driver, like a pandemic, can turn into an internal driver with a serious budget cut. There are types of change: organizational, technological, cultural. A change that could start as technological might end up in a reorg. The change in technology in the reorg may affect the culture, so it's possible for these to be intertwined. And there are different levels of change, incremental and transformational, that I'll talk more about. These dimensions, though, I put out here because they are helpful for those conversations that you need to have with people about change. They can help you make your case if you explain where the change is coming from or the type of change to expect, as opposed to someone coming in and saying, I'm a new manager, we're going to change things just because I said so. You're not going to get a lot of buy-in doing it that way. So when it comes to levels of change, we have this first order change, adaptive change. And this is something we've been doing in libraries for decades. We're always adjusting our processes, or folding in a new format type or a new way of doing things. And the second order change, transformational change, the very nature of it, it shouldn't happen often, right? Even those of us who are comfortable with change can't have transformative change every couple of years. It's exhausting. So understanding the type of change can also be a part of your conversation. And, you know, I could make the case that if you're talking about a first order change, kind of smaller changes, you could focus on those managerial skills, process management, time management, performance management. But if you're talking about transformational change, you need, you know, to deepen those skill sets. That's something that you really need to be prepared for and be intentional about. And this is one of the reasons with the implementation differences, these incremental changes, you can map how you're going to get there. You can communicate that in advance and prepare people. Transformational change, it's really impossible to know exactly where you're going to end up. You have the direction that you're heading, but you know the saying, building a bridge while you cross it, or building the plane while you fly in it, you know, that's kind of the nature of transformational change. You need to change strategy, but the process emerges. And the process depends on the leadership that you have. I've seen ILS to LSP migrations that had some technical difficulty, but at an organization with really good leadership that brought people together and they were successful and positive. They ended up in a good place. I've also seen migrations where there were technical difficulties and the leadership from the top was not uniting and inclusive. It was divisional, and it made it a lot harder, and success was a lot more difficult to feel at the end of that. And this brings me to another manager's tip. Risk tolerance is a phrase that you'll hear a lot when you're talking about change management. Some people are risk averse, some people are more risk tolerant, and that leads to their comfort level with change. But a common reason in my experience that people resist change is, again, that expertise is being kind of taken away from them. At least that's how they feel. They will learn the new skills. They will become an expert in the new system. But along the way, they're going to have a lot of questions. There's going to be a lot they don't know. They're likely to make quite a few mistakes. If your organization has a culture of perfection, that's going to be harder for them. So let people know it's okay to take risks. And even if you can, model that. I point out to people in meetings, divisional meetings, departmental meetings, things that I did wrong or the mistakes I made. Not because I want people to think I'm a screw up, but because I want people to see it happens. It's okay. And here's what I learned from it. And we need to figure out a new way where this doesn't happen. Now we move on to the second of the three, leadership. And there are a lot of different definitions for this. The simple way to say it is you're getting work done through other people. Thinking about the change initiatives we referred to, you're motivating others to accomplish work directed toward a goal. One thing that I think is important to note about leadership, as with many other terms that you will come across, in and of itself, it does not make a value statement. You can provide bad leadership on a project, right? Just saying that you're providing leadership doesn't necessarily mean that it's the kind of leadership that's needed. So it's important to know what that's going to look like, and that's some of the things we're going to discuss. Because I minored in math, I like to geek out to math formulas every chance I get. And this one leadership textbook had a formula about leadership, which is that it's a function of the leader, that person. And so what you'd want to think about is the skills you need to develop for yourself, the group members. This is also referred to as followership. So that's another area, if you wanted to look into, you can find out how to identify certain types of followers, the kinds who are going to be good change agents, the kinds you need to keep an eye on, right? And also the situation, which is critical, because people can be a good leader in one situation and not really in another situation. So this is where I get to the part where it's a little bit deep, so I'm going to move a little quickly, try to keep it interesting. But as I said, I wanted to look into the scholarship on leadership. And after reading enough books and articles that put things in different buckets and different categories, I kind of lined them up to see what most of them had in common. So what I'm going to show you are kind of referred to as schools of thought for leadership research over time. Of course, some of them are happening in parallel. There isn't a hard stop between them. And it started with what is unfortunately sometimes referred to as the great man theory, which is you're born to be a leader or not. Fortunately, we moved away from that into behavioral leadership. And the nice thing about that is if you can identify certain behaviors for effective leadership, then those behaviors can be developed. And the categories for these are task-oriented and relationship-oriented. So you might be very adept at some and not others that you want to focus on. Following this came contingency or situational leadership. And this seems like a no-brainer nowadays, that what makes an effective leader depends on that particular situation, right? The organization and what's happening within the organization at that time. Then there was also research done on what's referred to as a visionary or charismatic. And you can see that that kind of loops back to the idea of traits, but it also includes the idea that it's something you can work on and develop. And again, these are transactional or transformational. And then many of you have probably heard of emotional intelligence, but you may not know that there was a lot of research done on emotional intelligence in leadership. And there are some that believe that that is the #1 indicator of how successful you'll be as a leader. And so that's a competency I'm going to delve down into a little bit more in a minute. And then the last kind of cluster of theories or schools of thought is this competency-based leadership. And this is kind of where I fall now, with the idea that effective leaders have this toolkit and you pull out what you need to use at any particular time. And having seen those buckets and that kind of timeline, you may have heard, or you will undoubtedly in the future hear, on different flavors of leadership, right? Authentic, adaptive, participative. Complexity is interesting. The focus isn't just on what you're producing, but the knowledge you're creating. So there are a lot of different avenues you can go down, depending on your interests. And this brings me to a manager's tip that I heard during my IT leadership program. He was a former provost at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And it was one of those, you know, kind of aha moments that you have when you hear something great. I came up through IT and technical services. And for many people in that technical space, we, you know, kind of earn our rank, so to speak, because of our technical skill and the ability to answer questions that people have and solve problems. And so when that kind of person moves up into a managerial, supervisory, or leadership position, they tend to think they still need to have all the answers. They need to know how everything works. But as you can imagine, the more you move up, the more impossible that is. You just can't. And what you do need to know is that the answer's in the room, and it's your responsibility to get the right people together. It's your responsibility to facilitate that discussion and make sure everyone gets the chance to speak and to be heard. And that's what will help as a manager and a leader, not making sure you have the answer to every possible question that could come up. So competencies, the idea that there are certain specific skills you can develop. I think this takes, you know, building that knowledge domain out to that next level where you can kind of expand and see what's going to work for you. Even though my focus is on leadership change and project management, I think I would be remiss not to put out management competencies. And this comes straight from a textbook from UCL. I do have a list of resources at the end. And you can see that all of the actions here under management competencies are really about doing things right, doing things that are already happening in the best way possible. The leadership competencies, again, from one of the sources, organized them into buckets that I thought were helpful. And along the lines of what I believe, they list some managerial competencies here, some kind of activities that kind of need to be successful to be a leader. But in particular, you have this grouping of emotional competencies, which I think are just essential to being successful. Again, even if you're not in a position of leadership, leading within, emotional intelligence, I think is, you know, the one thing that's going to help you personally and professionally above everything else. I also like that there's this group of intellectual competencies, the idea of having that vision and then coming up with a strategy on how to achieve that vision, is central to leadership. And this brings me to another manager's tip. This is advice I was given by a very experienced manager. Her take on it was, I think, a little more strict than my own, but for those of you who, and even maybe if you're not managing, but you have colleagues, but especially if you're supervising and you have that person who's complaining about something quite a lot and complaining. This circle of concern, circle of influence comes from Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits. And the idea is that the circle of concern encompasses every possible thing that you could be interested in, personal and professional. The circle of influence, however, are the things that you can actually affect change with. And her rule of thumb was to say, if it's in your circle of concern, you can complain to me about it once. After that, I don't want to listen to it. We're going to focus on the change that we can affect. Whether or not you want to draw a hard line at once or not, I think it's important for your own mental talk, or if you find yourself talking to other people or your colleagues or the people in your area, your unit, your department, that you don't have someone or yourself that's complaining about the same thing week after week, month after month. If you can do something about it, try to do something about it. If you can't do something about it, I encourage you to make peace with it. And this takes us to emotional intelligence. Most of you have probably heard of Daniel Goleman, and the definition is here. Something that I think is important to note about emotional intelligence, unlike your intellectual quotient, your IQ, which is relatively fixed, emotional intelligence is something that can be developed. So if that's something that you're struggling with, or you know people who are struggling with, just know that that's something you can work on. They have nice little buckets that they put these in: self-management and relationship management. I think it all starts with self-awareness personally. And the social skill, I think one of the big subcategories under that social skill is growing your professional network. You need to have a strong personal network too to get through difficult times like what we're going through now with the pandemic and what has happened with George Floyd and the aftermath from that. So your personal network is also very important. But for those of you who've been in libraries long enough, having a strong professional network is also important. And for many of us in technical services, we're pretty introverted. So it might not be second nature for us to develop that network, but it's very important. There is an extra slide in the PDF that talks about each of these just a little bit more and gives a reference. And sometimes I think people still say, okay, I've seen your labels and the categories, but what does that actually mean? I did run across a leadership book that listed very specifically what this looks like on a day-to-day basis and how to maybe evaluate where you're at with that and how well you're doing. That I thought was very helpful. And I think what I would point out, and I'll circle back to it, is that to me, the most important part is the last one, the willingness to self-evaluate. And not only to self-evaluate, but be willing to hear what other people have to say. That doesn't mean that what everybody tells you is valid, but if you're just rejecting it, you'll never know if that's a possible opportunity for you to grow in or not. So the research that Daniel Goleman did into leadership, he found 6 different leadership styles. And one of the references that I have at the end lists the Harvard Business Review article that these are in. And what that translates to is that it's a single article. So it's a lot of information that's very accessible and easy to come across. And what I find most interesting, and I included this quote, is the ability to switch among leadership styles. So when I share this information in person, one of the things that I do, and I don't get to see faces, so I have to just guess and hope at the response, is to tell people I have 2 leadership styles for you to pick from. You're either going to be the empowering leader that has given someone the authority to make decisions and own them, or you're going to be the directive leader who tells people what to do and how to do it and when to do it. Which of these do you want to pick? And of course, we work in libraries, right? We're by and large pretty nice people. Everybody wants that empowering leadership style. One of the really great articles that I read about leadership was an evaluation of the lead doctors in trauma centers. And I unfortunately don't get to see your faces as this clicks, that if I'm in an accident, I'm taken to a trauma center and there's an intern and an experienced doctor, I don't want that doctor saying, "You've got this, I'm gonna go get my latte, I'll circle back with you and see how you did," right? So there is a time and a place to be directive. You might say, okay, but we're not an emergency room. But what if the website goes down? Right now our library's closed, our entire presence is the website. If we have a junior system administrator 4 months into the job, am I gonna head out to grab the ice cream truck that I didn't know goes by my house every single day, because normally I'm not home, and just see how it goes? Or am I going to be directive and say, do this and let's get it back up and we'll figure out what happened and make sure you're ready for next time? And I don't know if we have any public services librarians, but I can imagine a lot of public services situations where bystander intervention would be key, being directive and stepping in. So it's not that some leadership style is bad or wrong. It depends on the situation. If my house is on fire, I want the people who are coming to put it out to direct everything and to take care of it. So social intelligence, some people consider this synonymous to interpersonal intelligence, but it expands on emotional intelligence in that it refers to those social beliefs, social attitudes, the ability to manage social situations and change. And what is interesting in this, I think it's chapter 2 in Smarter, Faster, Better by Charles Duhigg, who also, I believe, wrote an excellent book on habits, is that social intelligence is linked to team performance. What they found is the teams that did better were the teams that gelled socially. And one of the links in that chapter that I followed and I've shared widely, and the last time I checked it still worked, was the social intelligence test. And what happens is that it has 36 pairs of eyes and 4 words underneath. And you have to pick what emotion is in those eyes. And as I understand it, it's been done enough that it does relate to the ability for people to empathize socially and understand where other people are at and how they're doing. And here's another manager's tip. At some point, I was just trying to spread them out so they weren't too close together. This is one of those things that I kind of learned along the way when you're talking with people. And again, this could be coworkers if you're not a manager. If you have someone who's struggling and you don't know what to say, think about what they're saying to you. If they seem kind of depressed and down, it could be that they're reflecting back on something that's gone, a time that's gone, something that used to be that they can't have again. If they're anxious, they're worried the sky is going to fall, this project's going to go completely wrong. They're looking forward and imagining the worst case scenario. I think the best you can do on that is to focus on where you're at right now. Have them focus on the here and now and what change they might be able to affect. I, in particular, I tend to be, anxious about things. So I kind of talk through this. What's the worst case scenario? What's the absolute worst thing that can go wrong? And can I deal with that? And how would I deal with that? And then everything else short of that, which is probably what's going to happen, seems more manageable. And now we move into the third area, project management. And this one is a little short for good reason. You may have heard Kristen mention that I'm certified as a project management professional, which was years in the making. There's an educational component and documenting 4,000 hours of project management work. and I got my certificate about 3 years ago. The thing about project management, formal project management, through the Project Management Institute, which is an organization with incredible resources, is that it's really meant for, to borrow from Alf, ginormous projects. So when I sat for the 4-hour exam, the instructions were to answer every question as if you're working on a multi-year, multi-million-dollar project. We don't have very many of those in libraries. The SUNY-wide migration, 60 libraries migrating from their separate integrated library systems to a consortial network zone, probably fell under that. And there were formal project managers at the SUNY level to navigate that. And then every institution had their own project lead, which was the capacity I served in. But for the most part, libraries don't have projects that big. If you're building a brand new, great big library, you're probably hiring a project manager with experience in construction, right? So there's a lot of talk about, I'm gonna move forward and then come back. So there's a lot of talk about project management processes, and there's actually over 50 processes in formal project management that get labeled one thing under the process group and another thing under the knowledge area. There's just two ways of looking at all of these processes. And each one of those almost 50 things has one or more documents associated with it, one or more tools or techniques for working with them. In my experience, that's just overkill for what we need in libraries. And I'm a project-oriented person. I just struggled to find something that was going to work for me. And it didn't really matter to me if it was the traditional waterfall or agile or some hybrid. I mean, agile has its place in a way that can be really, really helpful. I don't mean to downplay that, but it needs to be kind of big enough for the right type of project, not just, maybe the everyday things. So what I focus on are what is known in the industry as the triple constraint: scope, time, and cost. If you've ever heard the saying, good, fast, cheap, pick two, that kind of speaks to that triple constraint. The good is the scope of the project, and managing the scope is essential, right? The time is the schedule, the fastness of it, and of course, cost is the cheap factor. And for many of us, we are either nonprofit organizations or we are an indirect cost unit in a private organization. Either way, usually our cost resource is staff, and sometimes it's challenging to really measure that. But I think as we face these budget cuts from the pandemic and what's laying in future, looking around at staff who aren't very productive, those are going to be expensive resources. And that's why I think it's very essential for managers that you have those conversations and, set some productivity requirements and continue to work with people. The one thing that I always like to share about projects that's really important, in libraries in general, our work tends to be either processes, workflows, or projects. Projects have an end, right? They have a beginning and they have an end. If you don't know what the end is, if you don't know what the end looks like, if you can't know ahead of time and describe ahead of time what success looks like, you're going to struggle in your project. So what I have been focusing more and more on lately, and where my research is turning me, is on the next levels of managing projects. So the project management are really tools and techniques for a single project, and they are important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But where I'm at right now is program management. So I'm managing the projects in my division. I have two major lists, one for systems, one for resource management. And the trick to that is that you have a finite amount of resources. So you have to prioritize and decide who should work on what, and communicate the work out and set realistic milestones. I know some libraries have it, mine doesn't, is portfolio management, which would be, library-wide, every project that's happening in the libraries. And where I get excited thinking about that is you could align your budget with your strategic objectives through your portfolio of projects so that you're dedicated to the direction you've set in your strategic planning, and then everybody's on board with where you're headed. It's maybe not just business as usual, but you're shifting off to that. So that's kind of an overview of the domains for these three areas. But of course, that's just the beginning, right? At some point you have to, the rubber meets the road and you have to kind of take it forward. So the rest of what I have is information on things that I've used that helped with success. And they mostly all focus on communication. That is so important everywhere. Personally, professionally, in society, communication is very, very important. And I think when it comes to that, you have to start here with conflict. I tend to ask with every interview, whether I'm primary on the search committee or just an attendee, how do you manage conflict? And early on, people would say, oh, I don't really have conflict. So now I phrase it differently. I say, conflict is natural. Anytime you have, 3 or more employees, you're going to have some kind of conflict. It's natural. What conflict have you had and how did you manage it and what did you learn from it? Everybody has conflict. You might say, well, I didn't engage in it. I witnessed it. You're part of conflict, and this, again, with the opening statement, remaining silent is a decision that you're making, right? So I had some conflict management training my last job, and I'm going to share my aha moment with that with you in just a second. But when I moved here to Albany, I wanted to get connected in the community, get to know people. I moved here by myself 3 years ago, and I found an organization that does community mediation. And I have to say, I don't like conflict. I have all kinds of discomfort with that. But I also have discomfort with having discomfort over something that I think I could just work on, right? So I signed up for this program. I had to wait for the training. I'm in the process of becoming a certified mediator. I had my first 4 days a month ago. And I can tell you that I'm going to be wildly uncomfortable through this process. But I'm also very excited about it because it really forces you to get into that comfort zone of the more you do it, the more comfortable you are. And I think it all starts with this. The common perception of conflict is that you have avoidance and you have confrontation. Now, to circle back to something I shared early on, that I had one past position with this most difficult person, right? It's easy to avoid and to kind of tell yourself, well, gosh, she probably means well. And after all, she's older, so gosh, I want to be nice about it. Because otherwise it means I've got to get in her face and be difficult and mean. Or the person I worked with that wasn't pulling their weight, right? The avoidance is you assign work to other people, increase their workload, but not their pay. Rather than, be confrontational and maybe make that person feel bad about themselves, which really isn't the point, right? But the ideal process of working with conflict is that you're not avoiding, you're not confronting, you're negotiating, you're talking. And to me, that put it on a whole different plane. So instead of one person being frustrated with coworkers for whatever reason and avoiding, but going to someone else and complaining, and they avoid together, or the person who avoids and avoids till they blow up and then you have a big problem, you talk about things. And I think that's what's so key with leadership. There's going to be a lot of conflict with change. There are people who are going to dig in. They're going to work harder to not change, to prevent change, than they're going to be to help with change. So it's going to take people deciding to step up and ask the question. And that question is, tell me what you're thinking, right? First, you seek to understand. First, you try to hear where people are coming from. If you're not going to listen to them, they're not going to listen to you. So I'm going to do a quick time check here and step back for just a second to say that when I talked about the circle of concern and circle of influence, I also meant to circle back to my examples. I have had people in the past when I've talked about this you know, the quote about don't shirk the dirty work, you know, do your job. I've had people come up to me and say, oh, I have a coworker, or I have a colleague, or I have a boss who won't deal with this. Help me, you know, what can I do? I would say go back to that circle of concern, circle of influence. If this is something that you think you can help affect change, I think you should try to have those conversations. In the case with the difficult person, she was gossiping in my technical services area with confidential personnel information. And so I was able to talk to her boss and say, you know, somebody needs to talk to her. If you don't want to, I will. And this person very quickly said, sure, yep, go for it, right? So I sent an email and copied her boss. And I'll tell you, she wasn't happy with me because I was direct. But that's my job as a manager, to block for the people in my department. And sometimes that means, you know, making yourself a target so that they can do their job without, you know, being hassled. In the other case, the person who wasn't pulling their weight, I had conversations about that, and, you know, paraphrasing that over the course of a long length of time was basically, yes, we understand it's not equitable, but we're not going to make any change. So, you know, I left. There just wasn't anything I could really do. There wasn't much I felt that I could do to make my situation equitable. And it wasn't just me, it was systemic for that organization. I did, before I left, I had a list of the most egregious things that us other ladies in the library had been tasked with that this, you know, person wasn't doing, and I shared that, and I can only hope that after I left, maybe those things were dealt with. But I think this also speaks to the avoidance and the confrontation. You know, if you have an inequitable situation like this, whatever it might be, you know, in this case, it was a male who was paid a lot more than the rest of us women who were covering for the work that wasn't getting done. If you're a manager who's avoiding that, you're perpetuating the problem, right? So step away from the idea that you need to be mean and focus on, you know, that we have a job to do. And if we want to move forward in ways that are positive and encouraging, that bring other people along, managing conflict is essential. Transitioning now to communicating change. This book that's listed at the end had this great section on resistance to change and attraction strategies. And I have multiple slides that summarize different things because it has really been essential to my work in migrating systems. I won't cover all of the bullets, but I summarize them here. And what they focus on is that people are presenting resistance to change. There are a lot of different reasons. Some may be past experience they've had that they think are likely to happen again. Some may seem pretty unrealistic to you. The key is not only to listen, but in my view, to translate. Because as I've said, you know, when we take experience, when we take expertise away from people, they're not probably going to come to you and say, gee, I feel stupid, I can't do my job now, right? They're going to say, I don't like this new system because the workflow is wrong. It's not what I know. So it's not really about that technology. It's about how they feel about their value in the organization. So it's your role, leading change, managing change, being an internal change agent, to try to translate their resistance and identify a strategy to encourage their participation in change efforts. Empathy and communication go a very long way. So again, I have 2 slides here on resistance to change and 2 slides on attraction to change. They are in the PDF for you to review and to think about. And if that's an area, if you're really interested in communication and working through that, I highly recommend this. And there are a lot of other sources out there as well. And when you think about it in terms of what can I do to attract people to change, it's a little less conflict oriented, right? You're really focusing on a way forward that you can do together instead of kind of antagonistic. And so much of this has to do with making sure you have the right communication, which is very difficult for large projects. It's very, very difficult. Some people want to know every step of the way. Some people don't want to be bothered with details. So communicating large projects is very difficult. I find this diagram to be particularly helpful because you can see the top row shows that if all of these things are right, if you communicate well, if you make sure people have the skills they need, if they're motivated, they've got the resources, and you've got an action plan or a project plan, you have effective change. If you go down to row 3, anxiety, when people don't have the skills they need to succeed in this new environment you're creating for them, they're going to be anxious. They may not say, I don't have the skills, but they're going to show you anxiety and it will help you translate. The resources, the next to last one, this is very difficult with the ILS to LSP migrations because it's not like we get a break from our regular work to focus on this migration, right? That's in addition to everything we were already doing. And so it's hard to keep up and it's hard to stay current and people get frustrated. So I hope you'll find that helpful. Another manager's tip, and I'm nearing the end here, nearing the end of my time as well. Many of you probably, oh, and I have a typo there, you understand the connection between feelings, thoughts, and actions, or emotion, cognition, and behavior. And quite often you have a combination of feelings and thoughts that drive your behavior. And some of the problem we can run into is if you or your coworkers, if your feelings are what's driving the bus, as a past colleague said years ago, we're probably all in trouble, right? You don't want your feelings driving the bus all day long. This is where emotional intelligence comes in. You want to balance that with what do you know to be real. But no matter what you do leading change, people may feel a certain way. People may think certain things. At some point, you need to take action. At some point, you move forward with the behavior that you need. And people's feelings and thoughts will come along for the ride. They will. They may be very resistant on whatever change it is, but at some point you have to make the decision. You have to make it part of their performance program. You have to make it part of how, they're going to be evaluated. And in my experience, people will come along. And once they're taking the actions, once they see that it's worthwhile, they'll feel better about it. They'll think they're more that they're more capable of performing what they need to do. So I encourage you to consider working backwards. I hope throughout this process that you've had a chance to make your own list, your own roadmap for what skills you want to develop, where you want to take this framework basically for knowledge domain and where you want to grow and develop it. Don't try to boil the ocean and tackle it all at once, be selective. I would say to start with your emotional intelligence, to understand, what tools and skills you have as a leader and figure out how you want to grow those. If you have issues with change, I encourage you to work on that. I do have some closing thoughts on that. And again, your communication with other people is very important. Work on how you have conversations, positive change narratives. Don't be afraid of conflict. You don't have to be defensive. You don't have to be difficult. Just ask questions and listen. And I will close with, how do you want to be remembered? So for those of you who are very change averse, if you're out there, if you want to admit that to yourself, it's okay. For those of you who work with people who are very change averse, I would just ask you to think about how you want to be remembered. One of the jobs I had was for a state agency. I've had a few of those. And this particular state agency, in order to pay a vendor, the vendor had to be on file with the state. That's pretty common. But in this particular state, the requirement was that the vendor had to send in paperwork so that the state had signatures on ink. If we had a payment that was rejected because a vendor's address changed, we didn't find out about it until the payment bounced and the vendor contacted us, and then we found out there was a discrepancy in in the address, in the remit address, and they had to fill out the paperwork by hand, put it in the mail, put a stamp on it, send it so the state agency had it. It was very cumbersome, very time consuming. We spent so much time apologizing. And fast forward about a year, year and a half, I happened to be talking to someone in my division or in the libraries, I forget. And I found out that they now had a process where it could be done electronically. And I said, oh, great, they finally updated this antiquated system, you know. And the response was, no, she retired. So one person who refused to do things differently than they'd always done it had the entire state on a chokehold. It's kind of unbelievable when you think about it, right? Maybe we don't have statewide impact in our libraries, but I've heard stories about people, you know, about libraries that couldn't get rid of the typewriter until so-and-so retired because they used it every day. How do you want to be remembered? Do you want to be remembered as the person who, oh yes, after that person left, life got better, you know? Even if you don't like change, figure out how to participate in a way that's positive. I'll leave you with another more positive story. One of the places I worked, I had a system to implement. Actually, when I started there, I couldn't believe they weren't using this system, and I asked the dean about it, and she said, I'll just make up a name, Anne. Well, we'd love to have it, but the staff person who works in that area refused. And I thought that was kind of odd that I didn't know I could tell my dean no, that was never on my plate. So I said, well, do you mind if I work on that? It was someone not in my own area of supervision, but in another one. And we had multiple conversations. She admitted that she was very resistant to change, very change averse, and she was happy with that. And I appreciated her honesty. So I talked through it with her. And she said, I've been doing it this way for over 15 years. I don't see how this would be good for me. And I told her, you're right, it may not make your job much different, but it's much better for the patrons. It's a much better experience for our students and our faculty. And really that was all she needed to hear, because everybody who knew her knew she excelled in customer service. She was, you know, that was the one thing she was known for. So she wasn't happy about it, but we started down this process. And I was very involved with the implementation of the new system, but then after it was all up and running, she was in that position that I've mentioned a couple times, where her expertise now was kind of gone and she had to gain expertise in the new system. So I told her, I'm here for you if you need me for anything, but I don't want to micromanage, so just let me know. And of course she got up to speed in the new system. She's an incredibly productive, hardworking person. She just had this difficult transition to make. And then, I don't know, about a year or so later, she came to me and asked if she could move to my division. And so I talked it over with her supervisor, and we moved her and her functionality into technical services. You know, she was in interlibrary loan. Knowing that I'm a person with change, she still was willing to move forward in that way. And so the end of that story is that she ended up with a performance program that included annually identifying possible areas to improve services. Not implement, note the verb is to identify, but implement them she did. As soon as it was on her performance program, because she excelled in everything that she did, she adapted to being someone who could identify and work with change. She didn't love it, but she did it. So I would just ask you, for those of you who are listening, think about how you want to be, you know, that person who makes things difficult for people, or the person who figures out a way to move forward in spite of your discomfort. I just opened up the Q&A and I see that I have, oh, I'm right at time, so I'll have to have someone from NASIG weigh in on whether or not I can take a few minutes to answer some of these questions.
Our next session is scheduled to start in 15 minutes. So I think if PPC folks are okay with it, we can maybe just take 5 to 7 minutes of questions now and then follow up on the other ones later.
Sounds good.
All right, I'll do that.
Okay. And I'm happy to read the questions for you if that would be helpful.
I have them open.
You got them? Okay.
So I'm going to start with Cindy's question about suggestions on dealing with change mandated by upper management with no input from staff, and the changes impact all of us. Middle management is really tough. I have heard of kind of nightmare situations where the dean or the director would say what needed to happen and then step out. You really need support from the top to be effective. And having no input from staff on changes is going to be difficult. You know, one thing I would say is you go back to that circle of concern, circle of influence. You know, are you someone that can work with your staff to try to help pave the way? I mean, even if they're colleagues, can you have a conversation with upper management on what would be needed to be successful? That is a very difficult one. I have been in the situation where I've had a new manager come in and say, you know, I'm new and we're going to make this change just because I think so. And, you know, that's a tough case to make. And I see Kate has asked, since change is constant, and I think that's really the point of this. You know, we're moving to the need to continually adapt to change. How do you find the right time to celebrate success? And is it ever possible to refreeze? You know, that particular model, Lewin's model, may not be applicable for some changes. I do like the idea, however, though, of kind of institutionalizing the changes. So in the last story that I gave with the person in ILL, I institutionalized that change by putting into everybody's performance program to identify possible improvements in their workflows or their service. And that was the way that I kind of refroze in the new way, in the new manner. Finding time to celebrate is very important, very, very important. I would say ongoing, but then also to celebrate in big ways with big milestones. Like for example, with our migration at UAlbany, we had small communications throughout about, you know, thank you for this and that, but then we had town halls where we got together and really recognized the people and then efforts that they made. And Anne's question, what if the circle of concern are issues such as diversity and accessibility? You know, that's a really great question. And I jotted down something from the statement that Kristen had initially, which is, do we do this or do we remain complicit in our silence? And I think, I personally think that I have to make these issues such as diversity and accessibility part of my circle of influence. I may not know how, but I need to work on that. It may not be at certain levels, right? It may be community versus professionally, or personally versus community. But I think if these are things that you're passionate about, it's important to figure out how to move them into your circle of influence. I'll give another minute here to see.
Yeah, I think we probably have time for one more question if anybody wants to enter that into the Q&A.
It sounds like someone wants to speak to Anne's question. Is there a way to unmute him?
Tony is one of our organizers, so I'm not sure if he's trying to talk or he's trying to
answer the question.
Figure out how we.
Yep, I'm not trying to answer it, just trying to move it to answer.
I thought I was off the hook for that one. Okay.
Okay, we do have one more. We'll do that as our last one. How do you re-energize folks?
Motivation is tricky, right? Let me think through that for a second. One of the tips that I tend to give well, especially managers, but again, it can be helpful with your colleagues, is that if someone comes to you with something that's bothering them, and your first response is, well, that shouldn't bother you, or that's not an issue. What I have found is that people dig in. They feel like they need to come up with more corroborating evidence to convince you of where they're coming from. Where on the other hand, if you validate what they have to say and where they're coming from, they can take that off and say, okay, she gets it. Let's figure out how to move forward. So in your question on how to re-energize people, I have actually seen that validating people's concerns, whether it's their feelings or their thoughts, or the fact that they're taking these actions they've been directed to, but they're, you know, unhappy about it, just validating where they're at has re-energized them. But I think this speaks to what I've seen certainly at the University at Albany. People became just absolutely saturated with change after 3 years. And so sometimes the only way to re-energize is just to give people some space to go back to what they know, and to get caught up. You know, for me, getting caught up on my email is huge. I feel like I'm on top of the world when I have my list together and I know exactly what I need to do for the day. But I think another part of that answer I might say is to maybe find out what's going to re-energize different people. I'm introverted. I can go to conferences and give presentations, but I go back to my room. I'm in the fetal position with my iPad, you know, to regroup, because I don't get my energy that way. I get my energy being alone. Extroverted people re-energize socializing. So it could be that you have a group. We're really great with potlucks in my division. And sometimes people really get re-energized by kind of taking a break from the day-to-day and having a little bit of time to socialize.
Thanks, Janetta. I think we should wrap up with the Q&A now.
Okay.
But I did want to mention we have a forum for Janetta's presentation, and that is linked from Sketch. And you can also find that by going to the main forum link. And so if there are other questions that come out, or for anybody who is watching the recorded version of this presentation later on, do check in there for more questions and discussion. And Janetta will coordinate with you on anything else that comes up that we might need to answer.
Great.
And I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation. It was excellent. We really enjoyed it. And I think the comments that are coming through in the Q&A, you know, hopefully gives you a little bit of the audience interaction, and know that we're all giving you a virtual round of applause right now. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I think at this point we have a few more minutes of break, and then our next session will be beginning at 12:45 Eastern time, or 45 minutes past the hour for wherever you may be at. So please take a minute to regroup, and we'll see you back here in a few minutes.